I'm Beth Paraso, Senior News Writer at Tech Target, and this is IT Ops Query Season 1, Tech's Tragedy of the Commons. Josh Koenig and David Strauss are co-founders at Pantheon, a platform for building and operating websites. Josh is the Chief Strategy Officer, and David is the CTO. Open source software is a big part of the web, and Pantheon is a downstream user as well as a contributor to several open source projects. David is an early contributor to Systemd, a component of Linux distributions, a member of the Drupal security team, and was a founding member of the first Fedora server working group in 2011. Welcome to both of you.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Thank you, Beth.
Just to differentiate between voices, Josh, why don't we start with your answer to this question? Why don't more enterprise users contribute back to open source projects?
If you think about enterprise users of open source projects, it's really like a power law distribution. There's some that contribute a ton back, and then there's this kind of long tail, and then there's a lot that do no contributions. And I think that kind of boils down to the incentive structures for enterprise companies when it comes to open source. If you're going to really deeply invest in building a business around how a particular piece of technology works, and it's not something that's proprietary to you, you're part of a bigger ecosystem, then you're going to invest really deeply in pushing that technology forward, and you're going to want to have a hand in steering how it works, which you make through contribution. On the flip side of the spectrum, the majority of enterprise open source users, they're just sort of taking what they're given. A lot of that middle ground of the long tail where there's thin levels of contributions are like opportunistically, I fixed a bug, or it's like a 2-line fix to something that's just been annoying me. But most of the time, they're just taking what's given as a finished product and using it for what it is. And so there's just not the same mechanisms that would drive them to want to contribute back. Charity is not a big motivator for enterprise companies, and there's not the business value for them because they're happy with what they're getting.
Okay. David, what do you think? What's your take?
I largely agree with Josh on this. I think that the way that a lot of enterprises pick up the open source projects is itself challenging for them to have a streamlined path back to contribution anyway, regardless of internal incentives. When you have a software adoption model that is primarily based around off-the-shelf applications, proprietary services, et cetera, which is kind of the procurement model that a lot of enterprises have, you can tend to look at open source projects just as a sort of free and weirdly maintained version of that. And if you adopt it that way, then your employees are going to look at those things as end user things that they're deploying and will not necessarily feel enabled to actually dig into it and contribute back. And often the employees aren't even given the means to do that in the sense of the ability to, say, rebuild it or spend time on those things. Sometimes it happens through a vendor relationship where, let's say, someone is getting support from Red Hat for a deployment of Red Hat Enterprise Linux. They themselves are probably not contributing back upstream, but they're getting support through an entity that does extensive contributions and then is reflecting the needs of a lot of those subscribing customers back up to some of the foundational projects and components that are part of that delivery.
I would just add that the other piece of this is historical context. The fact that we can even ask this question is a reflection of how successful open source has been within the enterprise. I remember I was going to college at NYU in 2000, and that was a time at which it was like, okay, how are we going to run big technology? And the success of open source in winning a lot of that argument is in large part due to a lot of people doing hard work to make it very easy to adopt. And so when you have something that's just like, clickety clack on my package manager, install the 70 different things I need to make this application run, it's really great for adoption and ease of use, but it doesn't lead you to think, oh, well, maybe I could contribute code back to this thing, because you're not actually engaging with it at that level.
So both of you have been involved, obviously, in the industry and around open source projects for a while now. How do you view this current issue of the tragedy of the commons and open source sustainability? Why do we start seeing more and more companies change their licensing or go out of business when they sell open source products?
I think it's important to dissect how the tragedy of the commons gets represented here, because in some ways the model can be challenging to map to open source, because typically when you think about the tragedy of the commons, you're thinking about some sort of scarce resource that is then damaged by overuse of it or disruptive use of it in a way where it undermines the actual utility of that resource for other members of the community. Where in open source, you can have as many non-contributing users, like an infinite number of them, and it doesn't actually damage the project per se. So in some ways, we're looking at a bit of a different issue than the classic rendition of the problem. So we basically just need to have enough gardening going back into the commons and enough clear definition around the commons to have a good situation. And I think we need to look at it in terms of how we solve some of those problems in a few different angles. Some of the angles that I was looking at around this were things like, how are we maintaining the commons? How are we actually creating incentives around the commons? And how are we actually defining the extent of the commons? Because sometimes someone can say that I think this is part of the commons and not everyone agrees. I think that some open source projects actually serve as good parts of the commons and some of them don't. And in the sense that open source projects that succeed in the commons are the ones where the industry is collaborating around one of two things. And I really haven't seen a lot of exceptions to these two things. The first thing that I see successful in terms of gardening and grooming the commons in the industry are projects that just represent such foundational pieces of infrastructure or implementation that they just really need to be gardened over the decades in order to be effectively maintained. Like the most classic version of this is a project like Memcache, where that probably has, I think, a few hundred lines of code, if I recall, and has had a trickle of contributions over the years, which is more than enough to actually keep those lines really well maintained. And it's such a foundational, undistinguished piece of infrastructure that plenty of people have doted on it over the years, sufficient for it to be a really respectable piece of software. And then there are projects that are kind of more like Kubernetes, where they are serving as complements to everyone's work in the industry, where there aren't that many companies that are literally selling Kubernetes as a product. Most companies that are contributing to Kubernetes are treating it as either something to drive other products that they're delivering in, say, like the position of Google, where they get to sell more cloud the more people who use Kubernetes, and they're not selling the kube itself. They often offer that basically for free to consume the resources more efficiently and extensively on Google Cloud. And then there are companies that are consuming Kubernetes but want to do things with it that are not quite enabled by it, and they don't see it as a huge competitive differentiator, so they work on the upstream project. And then I would contrast these from the ones where the commons does kind of get trashed. When you have companies that are attempting things like open core models on certain open source projects, where they basically want a subset of the product to be open source and then thereby encourage you to license the proprietary version. And then you have the situation you were talking about around the relicensing of some of the projects. This is not the most charitable term for it, but I sometimes have called it weaponized licensing, in the sense that you are setting up a license where the terms for using the free product are distasteful enough, and by free I mean more in the free as in freedom sense, are distasteful enough that you are just pushed to the other option. It's sort of like you're serving free water at your restaurant, but you put a bitterant into it so that people order soft drinks. I don't think it's the best engagement model around open source, because I think it creates a lot of actually like animosity between the open contributors in the community and the company that treats that product as their thing. They want to sell that and be the gatekeeper to the most complete implementations of that software product.
But there are real implications when those open product vendors, let's call them, are not able to sustain themselves. That long tail of enterprises that aren't contributing heavily, that don't know how to run this whole package on their own, who might get value out of those applications that are value add, then they don't have that support. And then to your point, something like Memcache is maintainable with a few people, but there are other projects that aren't, or you end up with a situation like in that famous XKCD cartoon of the world on a pin. Ultimately, shouldn't open product viability be a part of this conversation? It seems like it kind of is, whether that's palatable or not.
I was going to mention the XKCD cartoon. That's such a classic. But that also gets back to how we consider the metaphor of the commons. And David's totally right that we're not talking about the overgrazing of a pasture, right? Because you can give out as many copies of the software as you want. But there's a different way of thinking about this. The more copies are out there, the more precious the commons is. And so there's this problem of actually things much lower down in the stack stack that are maybe undermaintained, but they're used by everyone. So it's like this very precious plot of land that no one is tending to, and if it goes wrong, everything else will crumble. I think that gets back to some of the other approaches of how do we redefine the incentives, how do we redefine the work to be done to maintain open source components. But to your point on commercial viability, like I agree. No one's really cracked the code on this yet, because dual licensing that's really tricky and tough. And I'm sympathetic to people who are trying to build businesses around open core, open source tools, and they basically want a way to protect themselves from one of the public cloud companies eating their lunch by just offering their thing as a service, right? The challenge with that is pulling off that transition after you've been fully open source for a good part of your project's life is very hard to do without it feeling like a betrayal of some sort. You've got so many people that are in the gray area of, am I offering your thing as a service, or am I just building something on top of it? It's hard. But then on the flip side, if you start out a project with that loud and proud at the beginning, will you get the same type of participation from people? My hope is that something like that becomes more viable in the future, because I think there is a world where for things that are not low-level libraries, but are less than finished applications, people want to work on new technologies for storing and sharing data. People want to work on new technologies for how do we do real-time coordination. These are like kind of still not solved problems on the internet. And there should be a space for someone to say, we're starting a project. We want to solve this problem. Our hypothesis is that we'll be able to sustain this project by turning it into an as-a-service business, and that will be a part of the long-term maintainability. But we want this to be an open source project where anyone can set it up and run it themselves, except we just don't want someone to set up a competing business literally copying our plan. There's got to be some way to figure out how to position that, because it logically makes sense that that should be conceivable, but I don't think anyone's really done it so far, for sure.
There are those two separate threads here, to David's point. And David, when I saw you were active in Fedora, it made me think of CentOS streams last year with Red Hat and the changes there. What was your experience with that, and how do you think it fits into this discussion?
I think it's a really interesting middle ground on approaches for it, because it slices a little bit of the value that different sides are getting in the kind of bargain that Red Hat has set up around that. And the reason it's really interesting from a slicing perspective is organizations that are more involved in the contributions to upstream have delighted in the transition to CentOS Stream because it provides a faster feedback loop on changes getting integrated into the distribution. It allows them to more nimbly steer the direction that the enterprise releases will be going longer term, because there is a feedback loop that is not just about getting it into Fedora. If you think about Red Hat Enterprise Linux as the aircraft carrier and Fedora as like some pilot boat, CentOS Stream introduces a mid-sized craft that is a little bit more nimble than the aircraft carrier, but is not simply riding in the dinghy. One mistaken impression a lot of people have of this is like, this was a change that Red Hat just pushed on the community, and that's not the case. Like, it was largely driven actually by Meta, then Facebook, around their use of it. Almost all of Meta's infrastructure in production and development runs on top of CentOS Stream at this point. And they switched to that from mainstream CentOS, partly because their open source contributions have a much more tight round trip back into CentOS Stream than they did kind of hacking them into basically the enterprise release itself, or a clone of that. And then I think it's an interesting way to slice the value, because if the main thing that you get out of classic CentOS was the idea of an extraordinarily fixed foundation with various certifications and every little change going into it being vetted by someone who is not you, then that is what Red Hat Enterprise Linux is supposed to be offering as its value proposition. And in a lot of ways, if your use case requires the differentiated capabilities of that, then you do need actually a contract with a company that is providing that release stream to you to get that certification and the support lifecycle you need around it to incorporate it into your own certification model. A lot of the use cases that were on classic CentOS, I see as bifurcating into use cases that really ought to get Red Hat Enterprise Linux and use cases that are actually really well satisfied by CentOS Stream if all you need is a very standardized and actually quite stable foundation for deployment of production systems, but you don't actually expect your vendor to provide you with the pieces to certify everything.
Are there takeaways for the rest of open source from that example? Is there a way other people could replicate what's good about that?
It's exactly the opposite of the approach taken by projects like
Mm.
Terraform, where what Terraform has done is relicensed in a way where the open releases trail the more like semi-proprietary releases that are going out to their commercial customers. And I think there's a multi-year waiting period before it becomes fully open source. CentOS Stream treats it the opposite way, where it's actually the fully open source side is the leading part of the project. And what you're getting through Red Hat with the commercial releases is the signed, sealed, supply chain validated, certified, supported, slow moving foundation that you want to build other things on. And that's a really interesting approach because it sort of splits out some of the value add in a way where it still preserves the value of being an open source contributor. Like, I don't know that I would be super motivated at this point to be an open source contributor to Terraform upstream on the semi-proprietary thing, knowing that my changes are not going to actually flow to something truly open source for years.
And certainly there's no incentive if you're an open source consumer. That's the downside of that model, is you're essentially saying the only people who could reasonably be incentivized to do work to contribute to the project are the paying customers.
Right.
Because who as an open user would say, I'm going to submit a patch that will get back to me in 2 years, right? That's not, this doesn't make any sense.
So, on the topic of low-level components and libraries, you've been following the Internet Security Research Group's Proximo project, looking to move the Internet's security-sensitive software infrastructure to memory-safe code. I'm actually reading their website description there. So, what has you interested in that, and what do you think the potential impact is of that on open source?
Well, I know David actually has a point to make on memory safety in general, which I will tee up for him. What intrigues me about this is how to better address the XKCD comic problem, which is historically the only approach has been, well, we all rely on these things, so everyone just needs to pay their taxes and we'll keep the open source maintenance going. And honestly, in a world where we don't have this now, and I don't think it'd be possible to set up, but in a world where you actually could have some sort of municipal entity that managed that at scale, it'd be appealing because that is a way to manage common infrastructure, right? But that doesn't exist. And I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. People should make contributions back to those things, and we have. What's interesting to me about that project, though, is it's taking a different approach to what you're contributing for. Rather than paying in for the continual maintenance of this over time, which will be effectively forever, the idea is, can we pay in to a way to replace this with a much more durable material? Can we upgrade the road from this pitted asphalt technology that we put in the 80s to this brand new silicon-enhanced concrete that won't crack for 50 years? It's not going to be perfect, but it's just a much more durable material. That, to me, is interesting, because you can then go out and make a case to companies that do rely on this underlying stuff to say, hey, maybe it's worth it to pitch in now to have better peace of mind for the long term that doesn't rely on paying a dwindling number of contributors that know how this stuff works. It's just the idea of approaching the problem with a different value proposition. But to David's point, and I'll let him make it, sometimes that the idea that you're going to fix all the problems with memory safety might not be as true as it sounds at first.
And I'll actually riff off the metaphor that Josh was working with around the idea of paving of the roads. Like, sometimes the right choice, if you're trying to solve a transportation issue, is to pave a traditional asphalt lane and then run a bus on it. If your goal is carbon reduction or dealing with the density of traffic, then a next generation road that is never going to be getting a pothole in it is truly a better foundation. But it's not necessarily always the most accessible foundation, especially with a lot of infrastructure we have today. And it doesn't necessarily move the needle on security as fast as certain other approaches that we could be prioritizing. I'm not against memory safe architecture and languages and frameworks. I think they're a good path forward, but I think that we can sometimes mistake the certainty for a path versus the value of taking that path from a perspective of what do we get as a yield out of it for the effort we put in today. It's very easy to create road standards that require using this new silicone asphalt. It's actually much harder to do transportation planning around the modalities of how people are getting to different places, all the different options for that, and waiting on the new silicone road to be available or to find the right contractor who can put that in place or to replace existing roads with that may not move the needle the most for transportation.
Right. Okay. Final thought here, each of you. What do you think the industry can do to improve the XKCD problem and the open product problem?
For the lower level underlying component, the broad approach of raising awareness of where we have these highly precious commons that are perhaps underloved right now, because this is a problem you can solve with data. And really, one of the biggest things that the industry could do, and they are doing this, could just be working a little faster, is prioritizing some of that work. That's an ongoing basis. And then if you can prioritize the work, then you can make the case for funding it, and you can make a case to some of these very large entities that rely on it and have the resources to really make a material contribution. The internet and open source are constitutionally reluctant to having a municipality type approach to things, but I think you can work your way towards some of that where you can pool resources, you can allocate them in ways that everyone agrees are smart. Whether that's rewriting things in Rust or just maintaining the dang C, you can get the lower level pieces taken care of. And then I think on the top end, and when it comes to creating innovation in open source, to be honest, I think it's a little bit less of an industry thing and more of almost a generational thing with software engineers and how they think about the world and where they think they fit into the stack. Not like, oh, AI is going to replace all coding or anything like that. But I do think we have a rising generation of talent because open source runs on talent. It's people at the end of the day. It's people making your life better for free. And the generation of talent I think we have rising into open source, they're very pragmatic. What we'll hopefully see is people finding a comfortable balance between the need to create a sustainable economy around these projects and the need to keep them open and free in important ways. The origins of open source were that those were fundamentally in tension and they were at odds. Definitely that was true in terms of how things started, but that's not how it has to be. And I think with the benefits of a lot of experience in history, we'll have people leaning into creating new projects that are intentionally crafted to be both open and commercial in ways that are not conflicting.
Okay. And David, what do you think?
So I'm going to start this off, and then I promise I'll connect it with what I'll start it off with. So I'm not vegan, but I really like vegan food.
Okay.
And I think that developing good cooking in that area can be really compelling. But I think one of the things that is often not compelling with a lot of vegan cooking is the attempt to contort things that were never vegan and do not actually have that compelling of a representation in a vegan conception, and then trying to pull that off. Like trying to create something that replaces the turkey roast in the center of a Thanksgiving table is just, you want to be creative with that. You don't want to just create something that looks like a turkey that is held together with clothespins, toothpicks, and tofu. There are compelling representations of certain things, and there are not compelling representations of something. And I feel this way about open source. I think that actually a lot of the problem with commons and open source is trying to contort things into open source models that are not really compatible with an open source model. And I think that especially the branch of the free software community that treats it as an ethical issue has contorted this a bit, because I don't see it as an ethical issue. I see proprietary and open source models as both reasonable choices. And I think that some companies involved in this space just need to be a little bit more straightforward with the fact that we basically want a proprietary model, even if we want a trailing thing where after a certain number of years it becomes open source, or covenants with customers where if we evaporate it as a company, it becomes open source so that you can still keep running it. You can get some of those benefits, but a lot of these are fundamentally just proprietary software products. And that model is proven and works. And for things that aren't well delivered in the open source model or feel incompatible with it, I think sometimes the choice is just to do that. Tying that back into the food thing, I think there are a million things that are amazingly compelling in the vegan world, and it's worth pursuing those as the ways to cook a really great vegan dinner, and not to try and contort something that has meat in it into something that looks like vegan food. And that's what I see some of these open core and other models. They're attracted to the open source world, but they're not actually building an open source product.
Yeah. Wow. From tugboats to tofurkey. I really like the analogies that we've...
I actually like tofurkey for what it's worth, but But I think that we're trying to contort some of this stuff into an open source thing where sometimes the answer for how do we get it to work as open source is, well, it's actually not a good fit for open source.
Okay.
Just as a follow-on thought to that, I was just talking with someone for the Mock Alliance. So this is like recency bias, but we were talking a little bit about how does open source fit into that framework of, they're trying to promote this notion of microservices, APIs, etc. Part of their origin was having to take a contrary position towards open source because the environments that they were entering into and trying to create change in were environments where people were basically doing everything for themselves. They were using open source in this kind of classic way where it's like, well, rack and stack the hardware. Now you're using a public cloud now, but it's the same way. You're setting up and managing and maintaining all this open source stuff yourself. It's all this overhead. You can't move that fast. And Mock is coming in saying, do it differently. Just use these off-the-shelf technologies that let you move quickly, pick stuff up, and integrate them. It doesn't have to be this kind of black and white proposition. I feel like there are certain places where like the free as in freedom does actually really matter. Like you want to be in control of certain things tightly because it's important to you as a business. But there's a lot of other places where it's just the ability to not reinvent the wheel. It's the ability to have things that are shared in common and you can contribute stuff back that helps your colleagues and helps your profession evolve and helps your industry move forward. Those are all valuable things to do, but that doesn't mean that you don't also have a bunch of SaaS services or proprietary tools in the mix. Really great solutions today, you got to have both.
Well, thank you very much. I think we can end it right there. This has been IT Ops Query Season 1, Tech Tragedy of the Commons. If you have any feedback on this episode or want to share questions or stories we should consider covering, please reach out to me at bpariseau, that's B as in boy, P as in Peter, A-R-I, S as in Samuel, E-A-U, at techtarget.com. Please also consider rating, reviewing, or subscribing to this podcast on your platform of choice.